Evening all. I think one or two of you have requested to have a look at the Carlsen Aronian game, which was quite dynamic. Now also on this Tata Steel tournament, if you do go to chessgames.com and have a look at the decisive games, and if there's any you really want me to video annotate, please leave a message on this video. I'll try and look at the highest voted games and maybe consider doing one each day if I can. Now this game was pretty interesting because it's the two tournament leaders at the moment and two of the strongest players in the world. So Magnus playing white against Levon, Magnus Carlsen against Levon Aronian. c4, English opening starts, quickly transposing into a queen's gambit declined, with bishop e7, very interesting waiting move. Usually in the past I think people just routinely played knight f6. So bishop e7 crops up here as well as in the French defence as one of my pet waiting moves. But okay, so what does white do here? Because knight f6, it's nice to have bishop g5, and bishop g5 has been deprived of, clearly, so white has to do something. And the problem with knight f3, it might give black some other options which didn't exist after knight f6. So anyway, a popular reply to bishop e7 is just to take on d5 and actually forget about putting the bishop on g5, just put it on f4 instead, and that's what Magnus chose. And he's had some beautiful wins with this variation. So the bishop's pointing at c6 clearly, but another reason is casting queenside is often made possible, often with queen c2, and then casting queenside. Okay, so c6, and now queen c2 was played, knight f6. And if white is going to castle queenside, then actually a sort of caveman style approach on the king side is more justified with moves like h3 and g4. What is interesting about this game, briefly playing it through myself, is this g6 actually. We're going to see prophylaxis from Levon Aronian on both sides of the board very shortly. G6 clearly indicates wanting to play bishop f5. So if white gets in, e3 and bishop d3, it's going to be very hard to arrange bishop f5. Sometimes there's a long-winded, maneuver to get a knight to g7 and then play bishop f5. But why not take the opportunity now to play g6? It does weaken some dark squares, clearly. Okay, so e3, bishop f5. And actually, instead of volunteering the exchange of the light square bishops, we have this seemingly, a waste of tempo, queen d2. There's a lot of moves in these high-level games, actually, to do with queen moves, really subtle, super subtle queen moves, which I think is one of the main things which is probably missing from club-level chess. Really delicate, moves, which you really wouldn't have considered. But in this position, time's not a major factor. There's no panic about the situation. You don't need to play bishop d3, and to keep the tension going. In fact, you don't want the pieces traded off. Without tension, the game's unlikely to be a draw. Now Magnus is pushing his FIDE rating at the moment. He wants to be even higher and maybe break Kasparov's all-time FIDE rating record. So he doesn't want exchanges in a draw. He's an ambitious player. So anyway, but here we see heavy-handed prophylaxis now, because clearly an issue with bishop f5 and not exchanging bishops is now g4 will actually target bishop with tempo. There's some interesting games in the past of Kasparov, I remember, with this g4 and then knight e2 to g3, and it looks very comfortable actually. This kind of space gain sometimes on the king side, and very useful. And later you can even look forward to chasing away the knight if you've got a knight on g3. But here h5, prophylaxis, against g4. But maybe now it's sort of subtly changed the picture a bit, that actually bishop d3 is acceptable now because there's extra weaknesses. So with this pawn move, okay, there's some extra weaknesses we can identify potentially. G6 is a bit weaker. If the pawn's here, then g6 is a bit stronger. It's reinforced by both pawns. So black's position is a little less solid with h5 in some respects. And of course the dark squares are a little bit more vulnerable. So bishop d3 is actually played now. So you might think this is really a big mystery. And yeah, it's amazing that the dynamicness and sort of the change of mind which is occurring here. So exchanging off the light square bishops is okay now. It's better, slightly better than before with this insertion of h5. So knight bd7, knight g4, and now prophylaxis is even on the queen side. If white was thinking in the future, you know, minority attack plan, you know, maybe rook b1, b4, b5, just to fracture the pawn structure, because once you have isolated pawn here on the segment file, that's usually good for white to work on. You know, outpost on c5 or just pressure on these two guys. But this is all kind of ruled out, you know, with a5. Black saying, you know, you're not going to have much fun on the queen side either. So no g4 for you, no b4 for you. Okay, so sort of bind strategy, not giving white a free hand. You know, if you do, you're just asking for trouble. So prophylaxis. So castling now for both sides. But now Carlsen does have the centre to change pawn structure with. He doesn't have to play for g4 or b4. He can play for e4. So he plays f3 here, which looks perfectly reasonable. Except, is the centre going to be a bit fragile? Is this queen a bit fragile? It's unprotected at the moment. Are there going to be tactics to exploit the queen like knight c5 in the future of this game? So b5 was actually played here, which looks quite radical actually. Okay, it might dislodge the knight if it continues with b4, but you might ask, well, what about, you know, isn't it weakening pawns? Isn't it creating targets? c6 in particular, isn't that going to be vulnerable? Okay, e4 is played, and then we have d takes and f takes, and now this little tactic on the vulnerable queen is used, knight c5, just to centralize the knight to go to e6 here. So now d4 is under fire. So bishop e3, so Magnus doesn't mind, it seems, being pushed around a little. If we look at the position, it still, you know, looks nice. He's got two pawns in the centre. He can play maybe for rook d1 and d5, or something to do with these pawns. But for the moment, Levon dislodges one of the knights away from the centre, but it's only temporary. Knight b1, a strategic, you know, sometimes the knights go strategically backwards to go forwards again. So here, you know, knight d2, and it will find a nice parking spot on c4. Okay, so king h2, knight d2 is indeed played. After rook c8, actually rook ad1 is played, not knight c4 immediately. And there might be a subtle reason for that, or it might not actually be that significant. I think knight c4. Let's just check that out of curiosity, if there is a subtlety. Engines do like a rook move here. So if rook ad1, what disastrous thing is happening here? It's nothing to do with c5. No, maybe it's no big deal at all. So knight c4, is there a big deal about knight c4? Knight hg5. I'm not sure that's such a huge deal in this position, but the queen is actually forked. So if there is a provocation here, so queen g3 and queen f2 will be impossible. So if white does have to play bishop g5, knight g5, again the queen now has to protect e4. So say queen d3 and now knight e6, and that's okay. It's not much in it for white, but anyway, maybe this is perceived as some sort of prophylaxis. This rook move, rook ad1, it does secure the centre a little bit more. After bishop h4, looks as though Levon's provoking a weakening move. But what else does it do apart from, you know, indicate, do you want to kick my bishop and create some weaknesses? It's funny, these weaknesses did count on the second rank, because often Magnus is wanting to cosily put his king on h2 and then carry on with the attack. That's happened in recent FIDE games of his, where this nice kind of coziness and then the attack continues. But here, if a move like g3 is played, then if a rook ever reaches the 7th rank later, then this is going to be a problem, having a pawn on g3. But what if the bishop was just left there? That's another little subtle question. Couldn't the bishop just be left there? Well, it's actually kicked, but what would an engine indicate here? Kicking the bishop? Actually, that's given us one of the moves. Bishop f2, even offering an exchange of bishops, or g3. Actually, he's given some preference to bishop f2. So actually the bishop does deprive rook e1, so it is functional in that respect. So let's say white proceeded with knight c4. Maybe also it's depriving g3 from the queen, in which case knight g5 might be more potent. Depriving the queen of g3 is another important point, as well as this rook e1 business. So here, but again, it doesn't seem that big a deal. Either way, white has a slight advantage anyway. So not a big deal to play bishop f2 or g3, but it is slightly annoying there. g3 was played. Bishop f6. Okay, so the bishop maybe is going to cozily go in as a fianchettoed bishop. Knight c4, bishop g7. Yes, we definitely have a fianchettoed bishop artificially. Okay, so b3, which looks pretty sweet, and the knight looks pretty sweet, hitting that a5 pawn, seemingly tying down the queen. So this next move is a bit of a surprise, actually. Levon disregards that kind of restriction. He's also faced with the centre, d5 all the time now. He actually plays queen e7, offering a5 up. But here, clearly, well, not clearly, but knight takes a5. You might think, well, queen a7 and maybe a2 is an issue. But let's absolutely verify what's going on here. If knight takes a5 is possible, I guess it's not queen e7. It's knight eg5. Queen a7 here. Just knight c6 actually is a strong move. Better for black, actually, and actually an advantage for black with knight eg5. So this is the point, the counter-attack on e4. So queen e4 it disregards a5 because there's a counter-attack threat actually on e4 here with knight eg5. That's the main issue at stake. Okay, so queen g2 coming away from this tempo gaining resource. Knight c7, and now it does look as though, given the absence of knight g5 now, that the a5 pawn is indeed on, followed by c6. If rook a8 there isn't time, there's knight c6. Surely the pawn is snapped up here. Knight takes a5. So what is Levon doing here? What is the point of this? Well, actually, it turns out now to be some sort of positional pawn sacrifice now. Because basically, if the white pawn can be prompted to move one square forward, then knight d5 will be a beautiful Petrosian style blockade square. And I think this is the idea anyway, that rook f8, if knight c6, queen e4, and then this e file, these pieces on the e file look silly. So e5 is really prompted here, and after knight d5 we've got a beautiful, it seems a beautiful blockade. Nh7 would be proud, this knight on d5. But it's slightly tactically vulnerable to the possibility of knight c6. But knight c6 in this position, to dislodge the protection, will fail to knight takes e3, I believe, because it's attacking the queen. No, there's knight takes e6 check. Okay, no, scrap that. Knight takes c6. Alright, let's check. Why is knight takes c6 as a tactic unplayable? Simply actually queen d7, and now two pieces are just hanging actually, so that's a slight snag with this position. Okay, so basically the bishop's got to move in advance, and it does move away from this threat. So bishop d2. So again, knight c6 now does seem on the cards. Rook ed8, protecting the knight. Okay, so knight c6 is not possible now. Knight f4. And now after queen a7, knight f4 does intensify the pressure as though knight c6 is on. And after queen a7, there's an invitation, to play knight c6. And it would indeed protect the d pawn as well, to protecting against queen d4 check. And that actually is played here anyway, because also we would have bishop e3 once knight takes d5 happens, and queen d4. There's bishop e3 protecting the knight, and this would be protecting d5. So it all seems to work out now for knight takes 6, actually c6 being on, and it is accepted as an invitation. So rook takes c6, knight takes d5. So the problem here for black, queen d4 can be answered by bishop e3, and I imagine queen e5, then there's a nasty tactic going on. But let's just check this position. In the game, rook c2 is played. Now, this is beginning to be a big advantage from an engine point of view, this position. But let's have a look. Queen takes d4, check. Bishop e3, queen takes e5. So is there a way of winning the exchange? Yes, actually there is. It's this rule, not this one, as I first thought. That's ruled out. But actually, and also there's rook takes f6 there to get the rook away from the diagonal. So in this position, actually the winning for winning material, it's knight e7 is the best choice. Then taking to avoid queen takes e3, and now it's possible to play queen takes c6, winning the exchange. So that answers that question, why queen takes d4 is not possible here. So black tries to stay active. He plays actually rook c2, but technically he's got a bad position. He's in a bad state of affairs. Okay, king h1 was played here, which gives quite a bit more time against queen takes d4 now. In fact, queen takes d4 could be answered, I think, by bishop g5. In the game, bishop f8 was played, but let's just verify that as well, because actually this is more complicated. The king's also on a square that rook takes g2 is not going to be check, but let's absolutely make sure of this. Queen takes d4. Is it bishop g5? Actually second strongest, bishop g5. Even stronger apparently, bishop takes b4, so hitting the queen, not minding rook takes g2. So rook takes g2, rook takes d4. Big advantage to white here. There's two threats, king takes g2 and also knight e7 check. So if this rook moved, we'd see knight e7 check, winning the rook on d8. So, okay, so king h1, nifty little prophylaxis move. Bishop f8. And now, beautiful, beautiful stuff. Tactical, exploiting the slightly loose rook on c2. And the slightly sort of, that earlier I said about h5 weakening g6 a little. Well, to really, bring out the flavour of this g6, if this was cooking a program, you might want to add some spices to bring out flavour, or do something to add flavour. Here, what would you do to weaken g6 even further? What you do is actually play e6, to really dismantle g6, to really celebrate h5 being played earlier. So here, taking on e6, there's queen e4. I believe this is the real crunch for black. If he had taken queen e4, hitting rook and g6, and it's pretty nasty. This would be, it's looking crushing. Now, is it crushing? Queen takes e6, bishop f4 now threatens nasty skewering the queen against the king. We're talking +3 from engine point of view. Is it so clear? It probably is actually, once the king gets involved. So knight c7 or knight f4, and it looked pretty nasty here. So basically, that's a bad idea to accept that pawn there. And it wasn't. It was ignored. A counterattack on d5 was played. But here, Magnus starts to slip up actually, tactically. So tactically, of course, engines dominate. And the engine tactic move is actually quite simple when you look at it. To play e7, which looks quite tempting anyway, because e7, as we know from one of my live commentary games earlier, can just win material. And it would have won an exchange here, actually, or even let's just make sure. So e7, and after rook takes d5, obviously, if you take, white's not winning the exchange because white's just lost a knight, but actually the simple e8 queening would distract the queen, and then queen takes d5 instead of taking the bishop. Just take the rook, exchange, thanks very much, winning the exchange. But Magnus actually sort of damaged black's king instead, which is also tempting in this position. So second best move apparently, e takes f7. Second best move, we see a little bit stronger, e7. Okay, so he goes slightly wrong from an engine point of view. So e takes f7 check, but it's still very, very dangerous for black's king safety. Looks very tempting to have a pawn protected by the rook here, and also undermining, of course, g6, which means knight f4 looks particularly juicy, now threatening knight g6. Queens get exchanged off, and now an absolutely cheeky move by Levon here, after king takes g2 actually. Well, actually queen takes g2 was the cheeky move. Or rather, Magnus really horribly blundered here. Why get the king involved? Why get this horrible pin? As we've seen from a video earlier today, you know, pins are pretty nasty things. You don't want to get into pins. You want to pin the opponent's pieces. So this is walking straight into a pin now, when knight takes g2 was possible, which actually had the double whammy of getting black in a particularly dangerous pin, winning material. If knight takes g2 had been played, not only is there no pin on d2, but if black wants to snap up the d pawn by playing rook takes d4 here, then actually, can you spot it? I'll give you a clue in 10 seconds. What move could you play here? So there's the clue. 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, in this position, bishop, you know, c3 is just winning the exchange, winning an exchange, with white being significantly up. Bishop c3 in this position. So that's why an engine argument actually is not to take with the king here. Significantly better is knight takes g2, but maybe Magnus, you know, he wanted to keep the pressure on g6. There are human reasons as well, and tactical reasons for wanting to keep that aggressive knight on g6. You know, eyeing g6. So the king took. Okay, but now this does allow, you know, rook takes d4. So clearly there's no bishop c3 as it's pinned. So the bishop actually has to be protected now. Okay, and now g6, okay, it's an issue. g6 is a major issue. And maybe this is the position Magnus has been checking out, because this looks really, really dangerous on that diagonal anyway after this next move, bishop c1. Bishop c1. It's an absolutely stunningly beautiful concept here that white is kind of forcibly winning material based on the idea of based on the idea of a rook sack to play bishop b2 check, as we're about to see. So rook takes, king takes, and there's an entire rook sack to get this bishop b2 in, which forcibly wins material. So even though white is an entire rook down here, he's actually going to be material up pretty soon. Because if bishop g7 now, then actually knight takes g6, splat, checkmate. So knight f6 is forced. Okay, so now only the exchange down after bishop takes f6, and now gets even worse after knight e6. He's going to be knight and bishop against rook pretty soon. Knight e6, so there's engine like white here. I guess it starts to, yes, advantage again. So this is an advantageous continuation still for white. But it looked as though, you know, mill was made out of things. But, you know, maybe not. You know, knight bishop looks actually quite tricky though against the rook, especially when we reach this position now where h4 seems a bit vulnerable. So white's mission is to first unblockade his two pawns to get them going. He has to eliminate that and somehow stop this guy. So that's the story, the plan laid out here. King g6, knight d4. So the knight's going to engulf this b4 pawn soon. Knight c6. Check. Doesn't mind about losing a2. Just needs one pawn, doesn't need the two connected pass pawns. So bishop d6. You might wonder, well, actually, is it a big problem to play knight takes b4? Probably accuracy is required. A lot of accuracy, I imagine, is required. Bishop d6 is actually one of the stronger moves. Let's try and just automatically snap. There's rook a3 here, and then oh dear, you lose your important pass b pawn. So that's not very desirable after rook takes b3. You want to keep your b pawn. So bishop d6 does that, I think. Because now, say rook a3, I think white just protects the b pawn with knight d4, and it's still attacking the b pawn. So yes, nicer to keep the b pawn. So a bit of accuracy here with bishop d6. So the mission is win black's b pawn, keep your own b pawn. And in fact, even the bishop didn't take because of another reason now. So again, Magnus is not that keen. He wants to take this pawn under his own conditions. If he had taken with the bishop here, I think there might be rook. What happens here? Rook h1, and then again now rook h3 is annoying. So if you try and protect this again, you've lost the b pawn. Oh dear. So no, the way Magnus is playing it again with this move is keeping the b pawn alive. So now after rook g1, king c5, and he doesn't mind his h pawn, I think, is about to drop. Okay, he's got his passed b pawn. Okay, now he can start moving the b pawn, and he's probably done his homework at some point, when he was about 5, for how to win with knight and bishop versus king. So as long as he can get knight and bishop versus king, it should be okay. The bishop is doing a wonderful job actually of eyeing h2. Sometimes bishops are bad at monitoring pass pawns. Not in this case. This is the bishop's day for monitoring that h pawn and making it very difficult for black to make progress. So pushing the b pawn to the critical moments of queening. And now, just at this moment where black might be thinking, I just need to sneak in h3 and h2 and win this bishop, and then leaving Magnus with the knight will be a draw. Well, actually, unfortunately, Magnus has seen a very nifty knight maneuver here to make sure the king cannot coordinate and herd the h pawn, because knight f5 was played, hitting that h pawn, prompting it to go forward, and now the very, very cruel move, knight on the rim, but still very, very cruel, very, very effective in this position, knight h4 check, sort of disconnects the poor king from the pawn, and creates a barrier which cannot be breached, basically for the pawn being assisted by the king. In fact, Aronian had to resign here. So let's have a look. Say king g1, queen takes. Now if you try h2 here, there's knight f3 check, and then we have knight bishop versus king. And if you want to try and improve that, well, how? King h1. Again, you just queen. And now h2, the king's in front of the pawn, so even though it's not check, the king has to move out of the way for the pawn to queen. Knight f3, winning the pawn again. So this was beautiful how this endgame was played, to manage the b pawn very delicately, not being in a rush to go for black's b pawn, getting out of the way, making sure this b pawn is nurtured, and not minding losing this one. And it was beautiful how the knight and bishop operated there. But so let's have a look in overview and summary anyway. So some great subtleties in this game. It seemed one or two moves an engine could have played tactically better than Magnus, which is understandable because engines see millions of positions in a sort of microsecond. So Okay, so this idea of a kind of positional a-pawn sacrifice was taken up actually, allowing a seemingly dominant knight on d5. But Magnus has these, idea of tactically undermining that knight on d5 because he's going to play knight f4 and knight c6. But now it seems that we're coming up to a point where it looks tactically crushing just to play e7 and win the exchange. So that was the first point where maybe a slight point of tactical imprecision, but maybe Magnus had foreseen this diagonal and winning material at the end of all this. That in this position, he's got the huge threat of knight g6 check. So there isn't many choices here. King g7 is knight e6 check. So it's logical to expect the rook to retreat here. So bishop c1, foreseeing maybe this rook sacrifice, leading to a situation he's better anyway, because he's getting all his material back and a little bit more after this knight e6. So it's genius play anyway, whatever way you look at it. But even more so, the kind of elegance of this endgame play, being a bit casual about losing a2 and h4, but being a bit more sort of demanding when it comes to not losing the p-pawn, which is going to be the winning asset. That's the winning asset, and it's gradually it's reinforced to be herded safely to the queening square. And it's remarkable, the knight and bishop coordination here against the h-pawn. You would think black had some drawing chances, and possibly he fluffed it at some point with some inaccuracy, which I'm sure some of you might post to the comments, where black could have perhaps tried to draw this game. But from the evidence of this game, this was great. This final kind of position. Okay, so Levon forced to resign here because he saw that he's not going to be able to herd the pawn. So I hope you enjoyed that and got something out of it. Comments or questions on YouTube, and let me know your favourite games so far in this tournament as well. Thanks very much.